Hello dear students, welcome to this series of lectures on plant ecology. Today our focus will be on structure of an ecosystem. Ecosystem has some fundamental characteristics. An ecosystem has a defined structure, and the structure includes both living, biotic components, and the non-living abiotic components. And these structures are related to the ecosystem processes, and the important processes that are there at the heart of ecosystem dynamics include energy flow and these nutrient cycling. These ecosystems are very dynamic systems, not static ones. So, for the abiotic components are concerned, solar energy for example, it provides practically the basic energy for driving the ecosystem functions. Inorganic substances, various nutrients, essential as well as essential nutrients, are a very important part of the system. Organic compounds for that matter, proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, they form a link between the biotic and abiotic components of an ecosystem. So, there are many abiotic components in that sense. Soil system is an abiotic component. Biotic components, so far concerned, it mainly includes the living components, which can be in ecological terms better understood in terms of the trophic relationships or food chains and the food webs. And these biotic components of an ecosystem can be classified according to their mode of energy acquisition, wherein we have say autotrophic group, heterotrophs, and so on. And organisms that produce their own food, as you know, we call them as the autotrophs, produce them from the inorganic substances using the solar energy, and organisms that do consume other organisms as the food source are the heterotrophs. We'll come to this a little later. Again, let me tell you here the two basic concepts. Number one, that species of plants and animals form a natural association, and that organisms are linked both directly and indirectly by feeding relationships. They emerged as the most important observations of the last century naturalists and form the basis of modern ecology. And to understand ecosystem biotic components in terms of the feeding relationships, the fundamental contribution has been that of the Charles Elton, as I told you earlier, also who termed food cycle for the first time, which ultimately evolved into the term food web, as is very well explained in his book on animal ecology. And those basic tenets, when I said that he has prefaced his book, the chapter 5 of his book, with those Chinese proverbs, which basically form the basis of the three pyramids: pyramid of numbers, pyramid of biomass, and pyramid of energy. So, for the biotic components of the ecosystem are concerned, let's discuss or start their discussion with the food chain. In an ecosystem, as I said, organisms are linked through feeding relationships, forming a chain of interactions. So, food chain is basically the transfer of food energy through a chain of organisms, or in other words, it is an energy sequence that starts with a species that eats no other species and ends with a species that is eaten by no other species. There are three important types of food chain that you quite often come across. Grazing food chain, which starts with the green plants as their base and solar energy as the basic driver. Green plants produce their food using the solar energy, and this becomes the first route through which energy is transferred into the system, and subsequent trophic levels, the herbivores, the other carnivores and consumers, they feed on these basic stock. And there are a number of examples around you of such type of food chains. Say for example, grass in a grassland being eaten by the cattle, cattle being eaten by the loin, and so on. Detritus based food chain is the second type, which is also sometimes called as the saprophytic food chain. It differs from the grazing food chain fundamentally in the fact that here solar energy is not directly the basic driver, but the organic food or detritus that is produced in other systems, that is the basic stock where from the energy flow starts. The saprophytic community, the bacteria, fungi, and the other actinomycetes are the important members of the community through which it starts. And sometimes people also distinguish parasitic food chain as a distinct food chain, because parasites directly feed on the living hosts. What you have to understand very clearly is the concept of trophic levels. A trophic level is basically the position occupied by an organism in a food chain, and trophic levels can be analyzed on an energy pyramid. Very commonly you might have seen producers are found at the base of the ecological pyramids, and they comprise therefore the first trophic level. The producers, I mean green plants, which directly transforms solar energy into the chemical energy, which in turn is then transformed to other trophic levels. Therefore, they are at the first trophic level and are placed at the base of the pyramid, followed by primary consumers, second trophic level. Primary consumers, I mean herbivores, which directly feed on the plants. Then secondary consumers, which make up the third trophic level, carnivores for that matter, which feed on the herbivores. Finally, there are tertiary consumers, which make up the top trophic level in the system. But in actuality, in the natural ecosystems, it is not the food chains, but it is the food webs that do actually exist. What exactly we mean by the food web is that usually many food chains exist in an ecosystem, not independently, but they are interlinked and weaved together through their individuals of the whole community, I mean to say. So, in this respect, a food web is a complex of interrelated food chains summarizing the feeding relationships in a community or an ecosystem. And such a complex of interrelated food chains maintains the stability of the ecosystem. A general rule is more complex the system, more stable it is. There are different types of food webs that you can recognize in the system. Three broader types of food webs so far are concerned. They include connectedness webs, second energy webs, third functional webs. So far the connectedness webs are concerned, they are also called as topological webs. They are those food webs which display all trophic interactions in a community without any reference to their strength. You must know that all links are not in an ecosystem equally important or equally strong. Some are much strong and much more important than the others. What this connectedness web or the topological web depicts is only the presence or absence of a trophic interaction, not its strength, nor any change in the trophic relationships during the age, etc. So, in that context, it is more or less a static food web. Second type of the food web is the energy web, what are also called sometimes as flow webs or bioenergetic webs. These food webs in fact quantify the connections between the populations by the flux of energy between consumer and the resource. It gives you a quantitative idea about or the strength of the relationships. And when you represent these relationships through sort of the lines or the arrows, heavier the lines or the arrows, greater is the energy flux, so far its depiction is concerned. Then the third or functional webs, what are also sometimes called as interaction webs are concerned, these in fact identify feeding relationships within the topological food webs that are most important to the community structure. In other words, it depicts the importance of each population in maintaining the integrity of the community as reflected in its influence on the growth rates of the other populations. You might have heard about the keystone species. In an ecosystem, there are some species which are very less in number, but very, very important in their influence on maintaining the integrity of the system. They are called as the keystone species. So, this gives you an idea about those keystone species. An interesting question is, what are the types of interactions within or among species in a food web? Well, the interactions within or among species in a food web so far are concerned, they can be direct interactions which involve direct physical contact, as for example in case of the predation, where a predator comes in direct physical contact with the prey that it preys upon. Herbivory, parasitism again are the examples of the direct interactions. Then there are some indirect interactions. That means when one species affects the abundance of another species through its interaction with a third species, what's called as an intermediary species as well. So this includes sort of an interaction chain, that means an indirect effect resulting from a chain of direct effects, or interaction modification, when a species affects interaction between two other species. These are the important types. Then there are 5 types of indirect effects that you can recognize in an ecosystem. Starting from the simpler one, the interspecific competition, where two consumer species in fact influence each other through their influence on an intermediary resource species. Then trophic cascades. Trophic cascades involve an interaction chain, that means a chain of effects. If at one level there is a change, its implications are deciphered at levels for above or for below it. Then apparent competition, that means two resource species also may affect each other through the same intermediary consumer species. Then the other two important indirect effects so far concerned, they include indirect mutualism, what's also called as interference, or indirect mutualism, what's also called as exploitation. Besides these, the food web also reflects some special interactions, such as a cycle. A cycle is a situation in which there is a reciprocal predatory relationship between two species. For example, species A eats species B, which in turn eats species A again. Second type of special interaction is the cannibalism. Cannibalism is a cycle in which a species preys upon itself. A species, for example, a human being preying upon itself would be an example of cannibalism. Omnivory, a species feeding on species that occupy more than one trophic levels. Omnivores are those which are both meat eaters and say grass eaters in that context. And so for the types of links that are existing between the species in an ecosystem or a food web are concerned, we categorize them into 3 broad types. Iota links is the first type, which is a direct unbranching link in a food web between a prey species and its unique predator. Lambda links is a dichotomously branching link involving a predator feeding on 2 species. Then we have gamma links, a dichotomously branching link involving 2 predators feeding on the same prey species. As I said earlier, these food webs are very complex in their nature. And when as a student of ecology you are to work out their complexity, it's a very complex question, let me tell you again. And this food web complexity can be measured in certain defined terms. Let me tell you to begin with, as I told you earlier on also, that very few ecosystems are so simple to be characterized by a single unbranched food chain. Usually, branching of food chain occurs at every trophic level. And more the extent of branching, more the food web complexity. And more complex the food webs, more stable the system, because greater is the number of alternative pathways. So there are some set measures of food web complexity. Let me mention here just 2 or 3 important measures of this food web complexity. One is the chain length. The average number of links between the trophic levels, I mean to say, comprises the chain length. So if there are 3 trophic levels, for example, say plant, herbivore and carnivore, there are 2 links and the chain length is going to be 2, because links will be only 2. Herbivore being eaten by plant will be 1 link and carnivore eating the herbivore will be the another link. Another important measure of food web complexity is connectance. Connectance is basically the actual number of links to the potential number of links. That means how many links exactly there occur and how many can ideally occur. The assumption in the connectance is that links only go in one direction. That each species can eat another species, but a prey species cannot turn around and feed on its predator. That is the assumption. One more measure is the linkage density, that is the number of links per species. I mean, what are the average number of links for a species? I mean, how many species eat a species, or by how many species a particular species is being fed upon. So, from the series of studies on these food webs since earlier times, some broader patterns of food webs have emerged and some generalizations have been made, what we commonly term as food web patterns. So, for these food web patterns are concerned, there are 2 or 3 important major patterns that you need to keep in mind. One is that connectance, as we defined above. Connectance remains constant as the number of species in the food web as it increases. Second, main chain length increases as the number of species in the web increases, with certain limits, of course. Then the third important generalization is that the top predators tend to be rather large and sparsely distributed, whereas herbivores are smaller and more common pyramid of numbers and pyramid of biomass that you must be well versed with. So, for the pyramid of numbers is concerned, always, for example, in a plankton dominated system, the number of phytoplanktons and zooplanktons is too large. So, in terms of numbers, they will always form the base, followed by the say frog which eats them, which is smaller in number, followed by fish and followed by other higher organisms. But this pyramid of numbers has certain problems also. Sometimes, say for example, a huge tree, just one in number, can sustain a large number of herbivore species. So, in that case it can be sometimes inverted as well. So, at that time you can represent this pyramid in the form of biomass, what you also call as pyramid of biomass. You can take the biomass of the tree. Biomass of one tree in a grassland would be far more than so large number of grass species. So, that would again make it upright. But the pyramid of energy, you must know, is always upright, it is not inverted, although there are some special circumstances which are beyond the scope of our discussion, wherein it can be inverted. So, these are the generalizations that have come up over the years, but these generalizations are also without not their own problems. Some important critiques or problems associated with these food web patterns include that when you review all these published works, some lacunae or some shortcomings are there. Number one, predation on minor species is frequently omitted from the literature. The researchers who work on it, they usually omit these minor species, either because of their less expertise or it's very difficult for them. Practically speaking, it is very difficult to work with the ecosystem or food web complexity in the system itself. Due to the lack of knowledge outside their area of speciality, sometimes also is the cause that some links are never drawn or they are missing from the systems. Second important problem with these food web patterns is that most food webs appearing in the published papers or works are too poorly sampled to be useful for developing a practical theory. Third critique of this generalized pattern of food webs is that data on the quantities of food consumed, indicating the thickness or the importance of the connecting links, are usually absent in the published works. Interaction strengths are very important. Some connections or relationships are far more stronger than the others, and that way more important also in maintaining the system integrity. That aggregation of species into what we call as trophic species needs to be realistic rather than lumping together due to some identification difficulties. In ecology, we quite often talk in terms of trophic species. That means various species, irrespective of their taxonomic identities or differences, if they have similar feeding habits or feeding relationships, they can be put together to form a common trophic species. Notwithstanding these problems, this food web concept is a very great concept, and it has to a large extent helped to understand different kinds of interactions or the level of complexity within the system. So, dear students, in this part of the lecture, let us conclude that so far the biotic components of the system are concerned. we have different trophic levels, starting from the producers to tertiary consumers, through the decomposers of course. Then we have talked in terms of the food web, food chains first, which I said is too simplification of the actual reality. The actual reality is the existence of the far more complex food webs. We have in detail, that's why talked about the what exactly we mean by a food web, what are the types of food webs, how many different kinds of interactions do exist in the species in different food webs, and what are the generalizations that have over the years emerged from this food web concept, and how these generalizations are hampered due to some lacunae or problems which we discussed at the last. So with this I take your leave right now until we meet in the next lecture in this series of lectures. Goodbye.